should the word empire be removed from MBE?
Now, I don't know why, but I'm going to go to Laurence first.
Hi. In my view, absolutely. Yeah, I think it should. I think we've got this very old narrative going on in the conversation going on in our country that is that the world was fine, everyone was really nice to each other, then the empire came along and everything went wrong, and now we have to that it was the sort of genesis of bad behaviour. But there were some interesting and useful things to do with the empire, like exporting democracy around the world and our language and all of these things. I believe we're custodians of these things, and we need to look back on our past and learn from it rather than trying to obliterate it.
So you think the word empire should stay in...
100%. That's just my view. But then, I would take the B out of the first B out of BBC. So, that's where I'm at.
Okay. Jack Dromey.
Well, I take the opposite view. I'm proud that we have the finest public service broadcaster in the world, alongside, of course, LBC in the British Broadcasting Corporation. And I
Neatly
think,
done.
With the greatest of respect, Laurence, by the way, I fundamentally object to you somehow depicting Keir Starmer as being a racist or feeding racism, is that you've got to face up to a simple reality, which is, I'm proud of this country. I'm proud of what our country has achieved over so many years. But to be in denial about the problems to this day, on the one hand, of the second-class status of too many of our citizens simply because of the colour of their skin, or on the other hand, to be in denial of the hurt caused to black people by what happened in the name of this country when we were an empire and engaged in the slave trade. I think it was an utterly shameful part of our history, and the best thing to do in terms of our history is to celebrate what is good on the one hand. So, for example, when our country came together to defeat...
we ended the slave trade. Do we celebrate that?
To face up to
white British people,
on the other hand, and not brush that under the carpet.
What good, though, would taking the word empire out of that? And if it's such an important thing, why didn't it happen under 13 years of Labour government?
Well, I'm not sure that particular proposal is top of Labour's priorities. But what I want to do is to take head on this nonsense, which says that somehow we should not face up to the fact that to this day in our country we have the unacceptable in terms of racism and prejudice, and that in our history most people had nothing to do with it, but in our history there were terrible things that were done in the name of the British Empire, and going back to the days of the slave trade in particular, it's a matter of shame. And so I warmly welcome the fact that at last we're facing up to this, and it's widespread now across society.
All right, Claire.
So, I used to work in social justice issues. I massively care about inequality in this country. And when I think of those disadvantaged people that I worked with, I cannot think a single one of them who would be helped by us removing the word empire. I mean, what does this do? What does this change? And, I think when we talk about the shame of the empire, I think I'm the only one on the panel, I would say, whose ancestors probably lived under the empire in India, which is where my parents are from. I think that we never talk about the other side of it. We don't talk about William Wilberforce. We don't talk about the fact that we ended slavery, that we campaigned across Europe. We give a very one-sided view, which is filled with shame of this country, when actually we were one of the leading lights to end some of these practices.
But do you think that empire is properly understood? Is it taught properly in our schools, for example? Yeah. Do we have a sort of rather rose-tinted view of the British Empire?
I mean, I think most people probably don't spend a great deal of time thinking about the empire.
But should we not? I mean, we learn about the causes of the Second World War. No, should we not be learning about our own history?
So I totally agree. And, schools can teach it now, and I think it's quite right that we teach people an integral part of the history. And I'm really for that. And, I've done a lot of reading on it. And, I think it's very much the case that we should educate people as opposed to obliterate things from history.
Eve Pollard.
I sort of agree with Claire. I think if it offends people, and if it really does, I think it's rather like Land of Hope and Glory. I remember having a discussion just like this and saying, actually, you should really listen to the words, because they're about freedom. They're not about creating slaves, and there should be a national discussion. What I sort of object to is people sort of come along, and it's the Twitter noise, isn't it? It's the loudest voice that says we should get rid
Laurence has got a degree in that.
Well,
I've got a degree in offending people, yeah.
but I mean,
on Twitter.
It's if it really offends people, then we should have a national discussion. I also agree that there should be more education about the bad bits of the empire and the good bits of the empire. But, you know, we're probably doing things right now that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will disapprove of. Lessons are learned. History is history. And if you obliterate it, then people won't remember anything. They won't remember the good or the bad, and eventually they won't remember the good either. I mean, I don't care that much, but I mean, I just think it's just too easy to say, let's get rid of it.
Is it right, Laurence, to judge people from the 18th century by the standards that society holds nowadays?
Absolutely not. Because as was so brilliantly pointed out, it probably, when they invent some genetic meat substitute, which we'll all be eating in 50 years from now, they'll be tearing down the statues of those that massacred pigs and cows. It's ridiculous. I'm again listening to Mr. Dromey, who I imagine we're probably not going to go out on a date at any point.
I'm sure he'll be relieved by that.
I'm so utterly and totally fed up with this nation hating, and I'm so utterly fed up with not looking.
He doesn't hate the nation.
He hates the nation. He hates that. He can't bear it. You can't bear it. He's ashamed of the nation, and he thinks the BBC is good, and the BBC is ashamed of the nation as well, and we're just being told relentlessly how dreadful we are. You use the word shame. It's a shame. And it's like, well, it was a shame 200 years ago. It's not a shame now. We solved slavery.
Jack?
Well, I think that's fundamentally wrong. My dad came as a navvy from County Cork in Ireland. He arrived in London and couldn't find lodgings because on the windows of lodging houses was no dogs, no Irish. He then joined the British Army in the Second World War and fought for our country. He's been proud of his Irish background, proud of his British identity, sadly now dead, all his life. Not to face up to the ugly in our history is fundamentally wrong.
Do you see those signs now?
And as for this idea about the slave trade had somehow good aspects to it, this was millions that were...
No one
said that. Come on, got a good aspect. I was just saying we solved that. England played a crucial part in ending the slave trade.
They did.
So why don't we teach our children that and teach them that slavery was appalling, rather than just teach them to be ashamed of the very country that they're going to have to grow up and thrive in? It's appalling. It's got to stop.
You're objecting to those who were challenging learning precisely those lessons, and that is fundamentally
I've not said that. I've not objected to anything.
Those lessons need to be learned. Millions were...
I agree with you.
Many were...
I agree with you.
On that note of agreement, let's... Okay, Jack, let's get a quick word from Ashish, who asked the original question. A very spirited discussion there, Ashish. Answer your own question, please.
Okay, all empires around the world did evil things. The Ottoman Empire massacred millions of Armenian Christians. So every empire has its good and bad points. I just think since the Black Lives Matter movement has started, with very noble intentions, it's gone AWOL, it's gone uncontrollable. Now they want Winston Churchill's statue taken down. They want, Land of Hope and Glory lyrics taken down. What's next? The Queen can't wear the crown because the Kohinoor diamond in the crown was stolen from India? I mean, what is next?
Quickly, Eve, you want to come in?
Well, I only want to say all my grandparents were murdered by the Nazis for the obvious reason. And every single country has done appalling things, still are doing appalling things. Actually, if you read about things going on in the Middle East, in Africa, there are lots and lots of countries who would long to be having this discussion about what we are going to do and how we should name things and all the rest of it. I agree with Jack. Education's terribly important, and we probably don't educate our kids enough about what we have done in the past. But history is history, and you cannot compare what happened 200 years ago, probably even 100 years ago, to what will happen now. And as I say, our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will be horrified we're using fossil fuel in cars and eating meat and all sorts of other things we've never heard of. We have to progress, but we have to progress together and united. This is a great country, and all I hear is moans about it instead of saying, I mean, out there, London is full of cars taking people to dinner. I think that's good because hospitality has to survive. I'll be interested when I go back if all those cars are off the road and everybody's in at 10 o'clock.
Well, that's next week's phone-in probably.